And that's the age-old question, isn't it? What makes men act the way that they do? Is it nature or is it nurture? Is it conditioned or is it something that men are born with? Shout out to Rob. Rob's been around the page for a while, and I know that he's asking this question in good faith. And these are just my thoughts on the subject. This is not, decisive scientific evidence. These are just my observations. Sure, by now we are all aware that we did not, in fact, just fall out of a coconut tree, but that we exist in the context of all in which we live and everything that came before us. So let's take a look at this question through that lens. Now, I'm not a huge proponent of the biological route when it comes to men and women, and I do believe that gender is mostly socialized. But there are some very interesting biological differences between the majority of girls and the majority of boys at birth. And these differences have been covered very extensively in a study done about 20 years ago called The Fragile Male by Sebastian Kramer. And so that's the study I'm going to be quoting from. So the big idea here is that due to humans' need for survival, there is no nurture without nature. And that nurture has developed to sustain nature. Let's see if I can connect all of that for you. Because at both the beginning and end of the day, this does come back to survival. So the study starts by saying this: the human male is on most measures more vulnerable than the female. Part of the explanation is the biological fragility of the male fetus, which is little understood and not widely known. A typical attitude to boys is that they are, or must be made, more resilient than girls. This adds social insult to biological injury. Culture and class make a difference to the health and survival of boys. The data presented here have implications for the clinical management of male patients as well as for the upbringing of boys. Basically, the study is saying men are neither more well-adjusted nor more resilient than women, and this difference starts at birth. I don't have the time to read this whole study to you, but this is actually a published study. Just type in the fragile male and this whole thing will pop up. So I'm just kind of picking and choosing which sections I'm sharing with you today. So just keep that in mind. By the time a boy is born, he's on average developmentally some weeks behind his sister. A newborn girl is the physiological equivalent of a 4 to 6 week old boy. The study goes on to say that this sets a pattern that researchers then saw in every stage of life between boys and girls. By the time a boy is born, the pattern seems set. Developmental disorders such as specific reading delay, hyperactivity, autism and related disorders, clumsiness, stammering, and Tourette syndrome occur 3 to 4 times more often in boys than girls, although girls, when they have such a disorder, may be more severely affected. It also says that conduct and oppositional disorder are at least twice as common in boys. This next part comes towards the end of the study. Like I said, I'm not covering the whole thing today. You are free to look it up. I'll also tag a video in which I covered other parts of this study and what conclusions I had from there. But what it says here is, this is where we're going to tie it back to survival, okay? If newborn boys are less mature than girls, then they probably require more attention. And the study observed that parents tend to mimic newborn boys more than girls, suggesting that as caregivers, they have to work harder with boys. They also state that infant boys are more emotionally reactive than girls. They display more positive as well as negative affect, focus more on the mother, and display more distress and demands for contact than do girls. That to me sounds a little bit like main character syndrome is something that males have used in order to increase their chances of survival by being more emotionally needy and displaying more distress and demands for contact than do girls. Girls seem to develop interest and constancy of interest as well as self-regulation very early on. And even just at 6 months old, girls have been found to display interest expressions more frequently than males. Female infants have more open eyes and higher brow placements than male infants, which may serve to lead observers to quite different overall impressions about male and female sociability. Boys tended to be too excitable, and mothers did all they could to soothe and settle them at some cost to their development. So because boys tend to express more neediness, they are also treated in infancy as with extra attention, which may lead them later on in life to expect that for no reason. Boys were also apparently more affected by maternal postnatal depression than girls, so they tended to sort of take it more personally, and it stuck with them into nursery school years long after the depression has lifted. That's another thing that sort of points to a self-centeredness to me. One of the most notable effects of this is inattentiveness and hyperactivity, which again, when you're not paying attention to things, it's very easy to sort of keep the focus just on yourself. It's easy to expect the world to just keep turning around you rather than other people, the people that you're not paying attention to. And this carries over into emotional states such as anger, whether this is because of a societally nurtured predisposition. When they did a study on communication styles of mothers with their 3-year-old children, the mothers did not judge any of their daughters to be angry, only their sons. I think this ties back to like emotional regulation and is just something that a lot of girls are better at naturally, like when they come out of the womb, than boys are. And this sort of like muddies the waters of whether it is really nature or nurture. But I think survival plays the biggest role into it, and I'll tell you why. Now, what we see in nature is that a lot of the male species has very poor rates of survival and reproduction. You see that in most mammalian groups, there is typically only one male or very few males, because males' survival mechanisms tend to be different than females. Females tend to be more cooperative, more self-regulated, more resilient, better equipped for like long distance type things, whereas males are more predisposed towards risk, towards violence, towards, higher testosterone as a hormone to help them survive. Because other than that, they don't really have anything that nature needs on a large scale to keep going, to reproduce, to grow, and to prosper. Now, most males in the animal kingdom, they don't consciously recognize this. They don't consciously realize this. So what this looks like in the animal kingdom is that in most groups of mammalian tribes or creatures, communities or whatever, there are typically far fewer males than there are females. In a lot of cases, it's just one male. Like there's only one lion in a pride. There's only one rooster in a hen house. And that's because the female species is not prone to violence and risk-taking and reckless behavior, whereas the male population typically is. So they don't survive, they don't get along well with one another. Now, humans have a distinct advantage, right? They have the advantage of consciousness. They have the advantage of actually altering their perception of reality and what's important, and we're also tool-based creatures that have invented enough tools to actually make us comparably small creature, can't really run fast, doesn't have a lot of strength compared to other animals, doesn't have a lot of like animalistic advantages, but it has turned us into apex predators nonetheless, because we have been able to use our brain to figure out how to hoard resources, how to control even one another as humans, let alone the animal population, etc. And not only in my opinion, but also as evidenced by some of our earliest written laws and rules and expectations of conduct, men use their maybe even subconscious knowledge of these facts to flip this idea on its head, right? This is why we have so many countries where there are now so many more males than there are females. And those countries are not doing well. Things are not going well for neither males nor females. The countries that are doing well have a much more even split. And the countries that are the most progressive have like equal rights for men and women. Whereas the countries where most men survive have laws and rules and regulations on women to keep men in this place of the main character, even though nature doesn't consider them the main character. Basically like a really desperate survival attempt. They're living in the aftermath of it. And that's again because meaningful survival of a species depends on its ability to be friendly and cooperative. And a lot of males don't have that. When exposed to the distress of others, young boys are less sympathetic than girls. A group of 6-year-old girls and boys were listening to the recorded sound of a crying baby. Many more girls than boys spoke kindly to what they assumed was a real infant, while more than twice as many boys simply turned the speaker off. If that's not main character energy, then I don't know what is. They're like, I don't want to hear this shit. Done. Tracings of heart rate variability suggested that the boys were more anxious. They could not tolerate the infant's distress. So tell me, what is better for the survival of a species? What the girls did or what the boys did? Exactly. Males don't often contribute to the meaningful survival and thriving of their own species. Therefore, they have to artificially make themselves important and inextricable from society by making themselves the main character and by putting women down and by oppressing women, which then becomes the norm, which is what we call socialization. But it's all tied back into survival because the male species knows that its survival is not that important as the female species. And the study basically confirms this. So it says, before concluding that maleness is a genetic disorder, it is important to note that the foregoing data are embedded in social values about normality. A hominid male of, say, 500,000 years ago may have needed all the opportunities for risk-taking that he could get just to procreate. Charles Darwin noted this. Many male mammals fail in their primary biological goal, which is to reproduce. They risk instead being excluded, wounded, or killed by rivals. Rivalries in human societies are more complex. Perhaps competition for females has been replaced by competition with them. The survival skills required by our our ancestors, such as how to calculate physical risk, are not very similar to those needed today, even though we still have most of the same genes. Male advantages in physical strength and spatial skills were probably more useful in the past. In contrast, while the preeminence of the few men who reach the very top of public life is barely dented by women, the modern male is now more often seen as lacking qualities associated with female, such as self-regulations of emotions and reflectiveness. It is clear that the male is more vulnerable from the beginning of life. Where caregivers assume that from birth a boy ought to always be tougher than a girl, his inborn disadvantage will be amplified. The data presented here have implications for the upbringing of boys. The more developmental problems there are, the more sensitive care is required. Yet difficult babies often receive less good care precisely because they are more difficult to look after. Biological and social constraints work together against the interests of the male. If parents were more aware of male sensitivity, they might change the way they treat their sons. Doctors too need to be aware that male patients may withhold their health concerns for fear of appearing needy or may ignore them altogether. This part of the study really goes to show that this male main character syndrome is still happening at the expense of the male. Basically, it's harder for men to get care because they have bought into the lie that they are stronger and more resilient and less sensitive than women, when that is, in fact, demonstrably untrue. Not only is main character syndrome hurting women in direct opposition to women's survival, it's also in direct opposition to the male survival, but they just can't see it because the main character syndrome is clouding their vision and their perception even of themselves. My conclusion of whether this is socialized or whether it's natural is almost irrelevant. It is the only way. It comes back to the video that you actually asked this question on. It's the only way for men to have survived this well and this far into the future as much as they have survived. This violence, this risk-taking, this main character syndrome, this hoarding of resources, oppression of women, the oppression of children, the oppression of animals, that's the way that men have survived. They have oppressed others instead of cooperating with them, and they have forced the rest of us into this competition instead of cooperation. This is what we're coming up against now. We're trying to figure out how are we going to deal with this moving forward into the future. There's simply too many men, and they all believe lies about themselves. But when we tie this all back to survival, that's when it makes sense. It's kind of pointless talking about these things in a vacuum, like is it socialized or is it natural? It doesn't matter. Our socialization is part of a survival instinct. And the people that have historically dictated our socialization are men. So it's both. They're the ones that needed to survive en masse, not women. Women have always had good chances of survival. Men used to fight wars over women. Men used to try and impress women at any cost. That's where all of their risk-taking behavior comes from. But the result of that was never supposed to be an equal amount of men and women, because that's always dangerous for women, as we see today, as we see in the statistics everywhere today. Men abuse women on a large scale, and children and animals and all of it. So it was never supposed to be like this. This is directly actually going against nature, but nature definitely plays a part in it too. Hope that makes sense. Let me know if you have any other questions. Stay safe out there, ladies. I love you. Godspeed.